Is that going to work? All right. And we're on. Okay. So welcome everybody to the, what is this? The fourth episode of the Philosophy of Power podcast. And it is Saturday, February 4th, about 9:11 p.m. And I'm here with the libertarian realist, or it's a libertarian realist, isn't it now? Not the libertarian realist?
Yeah, libertarian realist. I don't call myself the libertarian realist. I don't have that big of an ego, and there's always a chance that some other libertarian realist could either join me or replace me in the future.
Okay, so so I'm here with him, and he has a YouTube channel that he started. I think it's safe to say that we started out pretty much around the same time on YouTube, right? Isn't it about right? 2010?
Yeah, that's about when I started. I had a channel that I may have started in 2009, and it got banned. So
I remember
this
that.
current channel has been in existence for a few years now, and I haven't had a problem in a while with the censors.
And then you went to like Libertarian Realist 2, right?
Yeah, that's the channel name now, Libertarian Realist 2. But if you just type in Libertarian Realist, my channel will come up.
And you've been, your channel has basically covered race and IQ, innate differences among, populations of humans, and also the demographic decline. I really enjoyed your series on where you went around the world, basically. You went to Europe, you went to Japan, and you were documenting the demographic decline. Maybe could you explain a little bit, the demographic decline?
Well, those travelogue videos were certainly the most enjoyable ones to make. Part of it was documenting demographic decline, population changes, some of which are immediately perceptible when you go to large European cities, and some of which aren't. I've been to countries in the Baltics, such as Latvia and Estonia, that are still largely demographically homogenous. Nevertheless, they are suffering severe rates of projected population declines going forward due to their unsustainably low, below replacement fertility rates. So that's the other part of the demographic decline, is the white populations, and also in the Asian countries, they're suffering similarly low fertility rates, and they're not able to replace themselves. But the good news for them is that they aren't being replaced, at least not as rapidly, by other populations from around the world.
Right. Now, the demographic decline, as far as Europeans are concerned, Europeans in America, Europeans in Europe, do you ever watch any MGTOW videos or anything like that? Like Turd Flinging Monkey or Sandman
Yes.
Or any of those guys? Okay.
I don't watch Sandman anymore, but I've seen a few of them, yeah.
So the Turd Flinging Monkey has this thing where he thinks that basically, in order to get white birth rates up, you have to take away women's rights, because there's a correlation between the amount of rights that women have and the amount of kids, right? And so he's saying that we have to get rid of gynocentrism. Right, so you got kind of a different perspective on this, but you're talking more about immigration, but I was just thinking that that's definitely an important thing if we want to have at least a white majority society, that we need to also address what other aspects that are causing us to have very low birth rates, where we're not replacing the amount of people that die,
Yeah, and I certainly think there's something to be said for feminism being part of the culprit in misdirecting female compassion and the female desire to nurture toward things other than child rearing. And the feminists demand that women be equal to men in the workplace. Now it's gotten to the point where colleges are actually producing more female graduates than male graduates. I'm not against women's legitimate rights, and I'm not against women pursuing careers, but I don't think that should be considered the norm for all women. I think that it's perfectly healthy for most women to want to be homemakers first.
Right. Yeah, and then you have the the feminists that are kind of like demonizing those women.
Yeah.
And making them seem like they're part of the problem or whatever. Like it's somehow morally virtuous to get a job and be a career woman until you're like 35 and you hit the brick wall and then you might pop out one kid or something, maybe. It seems like that's what a lot of these celebrities are doing. Or they get into their 40s and they decide to adopt some kids from Africa and pretend that they're their own kids. Yes, I remember when I lived in LA, I ran into Rosie O'Donnell. I was on my way to the Virgin Music store, or whatever it was, Virgin Music Record Store. This was like back in the late 90s, I want to say. And she had this like caravan of adopted kids, and all these people were like pushing them, and she was just, well, I guess she has like I don't know if she has like a whole entourage of babysitters or something that she just takes with her everywhere, but yeah, she just had all these kids. And I've noticed that's kind of been like a trend with celebrities, is they tend to adopt a lot of kids. And they'd be like refugee, kids from the Congo or something, or whatever.
Yeah, they collect them as status symbols to show off. Hey, look at me, look how globally minded and altruistic and cocked I am.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't know. I've just noticed, the decline of traditionalism in the family and all that. A lot of people in the alt-right especially, will attribute a lot of that to, they'll say individualism is the problem, and they'll say that feminism, they'll kind of equate feminism to individualism, which I don't think that it is. I think it's actually collectivist, but that's another topic. But yeah, that's usually what they attribute that to, is a rapid rise of individualism with the decline of white children, of white people having families and white children.
Yeah, I mean, depends on how you define individualism. Certainly, if people who are self-absorbed and hedonistic, that on a large societal scale is unhealthy, and on an individual scale, for the most part, it is too. I mean, we have to recognize that there is a tribal aspect to our nature. That's how we evolved. We evolved in groups. And I myself consider myself to be an individualist, but I recognize that in order for society to work, that there has to be some kind of larger purpose, and that usually will inevitably entail some sort of collective identity. And, collective identity is not an inherently evil thing. It can be used for tyrannical purposes, but that's just an aspect of our nature at root.
Right. Yeah, I'm an individualist. I would say that I'm an aristocratic individualist, like Nietzsche was, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But I realize that most people, like the general tenor of human nature, seems to be very collectivist. And so I think most people can't handle individualism. I think that most people are actually herd animals. And I think that independent thinkers, egoists, if you want to use that word, are more skeptical and are more comfortable with themselves and comfortable with being alone by themselves, and actually prefer that most of the time. Not to say that, in fact, you did a video, I think it was on New Year's, about the Sigma male. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And I remember watching that video, and I thought to myself, this describes me to a T. Like, this is just, like, I'm a Sigma male, And I don't remember all the characteristics offhand, but I remember listening to that and going and thinking, yeah, this definitely describes me. So
Yeah, well, in terms of the wolf pack, the Sigma male is kind of the lone wolf, the outsider, the one who may be not wanting to be either a leader or a follower. Um, and, most people are inevitably going to be followers to some extent, but, followers follow sometimes because they want to climb in the hierarchy and eventually become a leader. But, yeah, for me, I just never enjoyed being enmeshed in those group dynamics. I just preferred to be an outsider.
yeah, I hear you. There's I guess I have a problem with being subsumed under someone's notion of the greater good, right? For the greatest number of idiots. That's just, I prefer quality rather than quantity, but I see the need for, at the same time, there's got to be like a balance where, look, if we're going to have a society, and we're going to have all these nice gadgets like YouTube and iPads and shit, we got to have like a certain amount of collectivism, right? We got to have a society, and the society is, by definition, a collective, right? So,
Well, yeah, even capitalism, corporate production won't work if everybody was wanting to have a job where they didn't have to follow any orders or be a part of a hierarchy.
right. Now, you call yourself a libertarian, right? And I had noticed some people on Facebook were confused about that. And I guess when people think of libertarian, they think of non-aggression principle, Rothbard, or these more left-leaning libertarians that well, you're familiar with Cantwell because he interviewed you. That's right.
Yeah.
So like the Cantwell types that are like red-pilled on the race issue, and then but there's the ones that are more like I guess what they were having trouble with was that they weren't thinking of the Cantwell types. They were thinking of the types that are like open borders and any kind of immigration policy is against the non-aggression principle because you're saying who can and cannot come on my land, for example, right? So, what is your libertarianism exactly? If you don't mind.
Well, I certainly don't consider myself to be part of any libertarian organization. I'm probably as hostile to the libertarian movement as it has been composed as anti-libertarians are. But nevertheless, I do consider myself to be an advocate of liberty, and the so-called libertarians who advocate policies like open borders are just advocating their own self-destruction, and that's very easy to prove. I mean, just say, okay, you want completely open borders, then you're going to invite in, if you had this small libertarian island out there that was privately owned, you're going to say, okay, you have to have open borders, you have to invite in Islamists, you have to invite in anarcho-communists, and outright terrorists of any kind, of any ideology. Well, that would obviously quickly destroy that little libertarian island, and it wouldn't be libertarian anymore, and just apply that logic to a nation. I'm not against immigration per se, but it has to be compatible with the character of the nation, and part of the character of a nation that I would want to live in would be one that respects individual liberty.
Right. I think I've always kind of been, because I'm, like my psychology is individualistic. I think that I've always been kind of like, well, just apolitical. And it wasn't till this year or this past year that I actually got into politics at all. Like I literally was not political at all. I was interested in metaethics and ontology and things of a deeper philosophical bent. And then this year came around, and you see all this demonization of white males and a group that I happen to be a part of, and that it's like it kind of forced me out of like self-defense to pay attention to politics and actually endorse a president for once, because I never endorsed a president, never voted ever in my life, and then this year came around, and just things got so polarized that it just kind of forced me to take a stand. And so I've always been kind of like individualistic, like had an individualistic outlook, like do whatever you want, just keep it out of my face, right? If you want to have your lesbian love affair, or if you want to be a heroin addict with your life, you want to destroy your life with drugs, I don't care, do it. It's you, right? It has nothing to do with me. That's how I've always kind of looked at it. But now, when I've kind of looked at it differently this year, because I realized that if someone does become a heroin addict, like heroin is a big problem here in New Hampshire. Like I live down the street from Christopher Cantwell. Actually, I live here in Keene, New Hampshire, and there's not a lot of minorities here. It's like 90-something% white. Okay, and but there's a big heroin problem here, and it's caused me to realize that someone gets hooked on drugs, someone gets hooked on heroin, let's say, and then they go on welfare, right? So then I end up paying for it, you end up paying for it, everybody ends up paying for it, and we don't. I guess this year has forced me to see that we don't live in a vacuum. And what other people do does affect us when we live in the type of society that we live in now, a democratic kind of society where you're being taxed, right? It's not Ancapistan, right? So you're being forced to subsidize behavior that you don't want to subsidize.
Yeah, and you can't have a well-functioning society that's completely full of drug addicts. And on a smaller scale, the presence of drug addicts will increase the drain on public so-called resources, such as police and emergency rooms, etc. So inevitably, there is going to be a cost that they pass on to the rest of the people who are not drug addicts.
Right. I'll tell you what, this year has been so stressful. I've wanted to just buy some land out in the middle of nowhere and just not talk to anybody ever again. Probably somewhere in Montana, somewhere up there. But I don't know.
Montana's nice, yes.
I hear it's really nice. I've been through there. I've been to just about every state in the country, but I haven't actually stayed in Montana very long, so I don't really know that much about it. I just know that it's, very... what is the biggest city there? It's probably got, maybe 1 million people? Something like that?
Oh, there's barely over 1 million people in the whole state. The biggest cities are Missoula and Billings, and they have less than 200,000 people each.
Jeez, I might have to move there at some point.
Well, I was in New Hampshire, about 12 years ago, the one and only time I went through New Hampshire. It was nice, pleasant, but, it was too close to Massachusetts and for my state.
Yeah, the mass holes.
The big open expanses of Montana. You can drive 6 hours and still be in Montana.
Right. When I first started listening to your channel, when I first became a subscriber, and I know you've commented on some of my videos throughout the years, but when I first heard about you, I was actually living in California. So it was a totally different thing. And it's funny because, like, you were one of the main people that red-pilled me on the issue of race. I remember, like, because I traveled a lot, and I was born in Jersey, okay? And Jersey, is very vibrant. And I'd also lived in New York City and L.A. and all those different places. And I would see kind of like a minority tax. Kind of like a minority tax is when there's something that you have to put up with in the name of diversity, right? So, like for example, I was in a lot of neighborhoods that were there's a lot of reverse discrimination and racism against white people, where you were seen as a snitch or something just because you were white, right? Or something like that. You were considered some sort of negative label because you were white. And just a lot of like, I don't know how to describe it, but just a lot of like intimidation and violence towards white people in an area that is primarily dominated by minorities. Okay.
Was this like in Southern California near Los Angeles?
Oh yeah, San Diego, Los Angeles, and New York as well, and New Jersey, like especially towards like South Jersey and Central Jersey. It's pretty bad. Like Trenton, Newark's really bad. But I more or less spent a lot of my teenage years in North Jersey, which is more like Italian and white, and at least when I was growing up. Now it's a bit more diverse, but that, like, I've always recognized on some level that there's a difference, right, between white communities, between white people as a whole, and minority communities, right? I've experienced it hands-on, right? But I never thought about it deeply enough to go, is this just environmental? Is this poverty? Or is this something innate? Is this something genetic, right? And I didn't really give that a serious thought. I didn't really think about it that deeply until I started watching your channel and, some of Jared Taylor's stuff. And I'm trying to think of the guy who died a couple of years back.
Rushton?
Yeah, Rushton. That's it. Yeah, until I really started looking at their stuff, and it started to, come together for me. But it was definitely something difficult for me, I think, as someone who's kind of individualistically minded and doesn't really care about that stuff so much. Because I tend to judge people on an individual level, and I've met shitty people from many different ethnicities, if you will. And there's a few white or black people here in town. There's not very many black people here in general in New Hampshire. I don't know if it's just too cold for them or what, but the ones that are here, here's something I've noticed, is that the ones that are here are pretty assimilated. Like they're black, like their skin's black, their bone structure's different. They're black, right? But they talk white, they act white, and they're pretty good. They're not like stealing shit. They're not out gang banging or wearing their pants down on their ankles. And I've noticed that about minorities is that if they're in a minority neighborhood that's dominated by that race or that group or whatever, there tends to be a lot of crime. But if it's like one or two here and there, it tends to be all right. Have you seen that or noticed that? Or
Well, there may be a slight tendency toward that, but if you look at test scores, for example, in places as far removed as Wisconsin, where there are relatively few blacks, and Texas, where there are a lot more, see the same patterns. Now, it could be the case that in a place like New Hampshire that they kind of get more of a higher IQ, lower crime proclivity type of migration from blacks who would voluntarily want to choose to move there, as opposed to just blacks who were born in the ghetto and ended up staying in the ghetto.
Right.
But we should also be precise when talking about racial differences, and that we don't generalize minorities as being part of one group, because Asian minorities tend to have lower crime rates and higher test scores and higher incomes than whites do on average.
Yes, I'm aware of that. I guess I should have specified not all minorities, obviously, but particular minorities, especially blacks. There's a lot of violence in black neighborhoods. I don't care where you go, My dad was one of those like funny Christian types, and he used to always warn me about hanging out with black kids when I was younger, and I think we were in Maryland at the time, and there actually wasn't too many at that time. We lived in Rockville for a while, And this school that I went to was almost all white. In fact, I don't even remember a single black kid in that school. You go there now, of course, and it's all blacks, pretty much. It's totally changed. Like the house that I used to live in, I lived in this old like 200-year-old farmhouse. It's still there, but everything else is gone. The only reason why it's still there is because it was turned into some national landmark or something. It was preserved or whatever. But all around it is all Dinduville. It's like a bunch of projects and shit. And all that used to be open fields where me and my sister used to run and play, and there was just acre and acre of just, woods and fields and stuff. Now it's just all, run down apartment complexes, and I mean, it's just all, it's shit. So you live in Montana, right? And what is it? What's it like there? I mean, only a million, would you say a million people? Is it?
I think it's up to about 1.1 million. That's about all there is in the whole state.
Wow. So is the property value pretty high there? Like,
cost of living are relatively low. House prices have gone up over the past few years, but it depends on where you want to live. If you want to live in Missoula or Bozeman, they're a little more expensive. If you don't mind living further out, you can find cheaper places. You can find a 1,500 square foot house on an acre of land for much cheaper than you could get a little studio apartment in San Francisco or somewhere.
Right. Now, I'm not a libertarian, but I originally came out here for the Free State Project, right? And it wasn't. Well, I should preface that it wasn't for the Free State Project. It was more or less when I read their website for the 101 Reasons to Move to New Hampshire. I saw that there was like one of those things was like they had hardly any regulation here. It was very free compared to at least where I was, in California. And so the idea of the Free State Project was to have all of these libertarians, or a good portion of them, move to New Hampshire and then possibly secede, or at least make New Hampshire even smaller of a government than it already is, right? So that was kind of like the premise, the goal behind everybody moving here. And so I was wondering for something like that for the alt-right. Like, do you think Montana would be something great for that, for like a bunch of, alt-right people to say, hey, let's make New Hampshire, or not New Hampshire, let's make Montana, a white enclave, if you will, of a bastion? Or do you think that HUD will, if we do that, HUD will just start flooding in, all kinds of like minorities and Dindus and shit in there?
I asked Richard Spencer that question when I met up with him in Whitefish, Montana last spring, and he said that he welcomes people who want to move in Montana because they value the lifestyle, but he doesn't suggest that people do that purely for ideological reasons. And it's just kind of a thing where until there's a critical mass of people doing it, there's no point in trying to get something started to that effect if you don't value the actual lifestyle that you're going to live here. I think it's a pretty good lifestyle, but there aren't a lot of really good, high-paying, white-collar jobs here. It's mostly agriculture, tourism-related. There's some mining and forestry jobs, things like that. So the average wages in Montana are relatively low, but then again, the cost of living are relatively low too.
Right.
And some people have these dreams of like a northwest front and of Washington, Idaho, and Montana becoming a white homeland.
Yeah, I've heard this one.
I don't think that's realistic at all. I think you'd have to start out much smaller.
So what do you think is realistic? Like, we've got Trump in office now, and, we've had a little setback recently with that quote, or putting a stop to his executive orders concerning certain Islamic countries. But other than that, he seems to be doing pretty much what he said he was going to do. At least that's how it seems to me. Where do you see the goals of the alt-right? Where do you think it should be? Like what should we be doing? What's realistic goal to shoot for?
Well, I would give Trump relatively high marks for the way that he's gotten off to a start of unleashing executive orders and starting to go forward with major plans on deregulation. And so he's definitely going to be a very consequential president in terms of the policy changes that he's going to push. I would like to see him push more on the issue of defunding not only the refugees, and I think probably a better public relations rollout of this plan would have been to start first by defunding all the refugee resettlement programs that get cash from the federal government before you just start saying you want to ban people. And we should also go on, and he tweeted about potentially defunding Cal Berkeley over the fact of the anti-free speech riots there. So that's something that needs to be done on a much larger scale. These parasitic professional leftists who sit on publicly funded universities need to be defunded systematically.
Right. No, I definitely agree there. And that actually kind of brings me into another topic here, which is so I'm a philosopher, and I've written a book on metaethics, and so I kind of know a lot of people. I know a significant amount, let's put it that way, of people that are philosophers that work in these institutions, and that don't have these leftist-leaning kind of ideologies permeating their thought strands, and so they are like stuck in a a screwed up situation, and so I can kind of speak firsthand on that there are our institutions are just filled with people just indoctrinating these children, these kids that come in, and when you're 18, 19 years old and you're going into college, you don't know shit. And so you're very vulnerable to being indoctrinated into, for example, the doctrine of white privilege or the doctrines of equality and egalitarianism and left-wing fascism. That's basically what we've seen right now on the streets taking place, where you've seen the recent Milo and Yiannopoulos attacks there at Berkeley, where
it's Bolshevism.
So a lot of utopian communist kind of bullshit being pumped into kids' heads, and then then we wonder why we have these kids filling the streets protesting everything that Trump does, right? Because it doesn't matter what he does, even if he concedes a little bit to the left and he gives them a certain policy that they want, he's still going to be a Nazi, Hitler, or whatever the fuck label they want to put on him, right? That's just conceding to the left doesn't do anything, right?
Yeah, of course. And I think he's like one of the first presidents who doesn't care anymore.
So my concern is, as someone who, doesn't teach in an academic setting for sure. Doesn't, I don't teach at an institution, but as somebody who likes to teach, I am concerned about. I'm concerned about this because they're just going to keep pumping out more and more brainwashed masses until we get these people, until we purge the left out of academia, and that's just the only thing. I mean, I don't know if he can do that through cutting funding, or there's got to be some way that he can get these people out,
you've got to be as ruthless as the left was in imposing their agenda through federal mandates and federal strings attached to every dollar that gets sent to universities, requiring them to obey all these so-called civil rights mandates. Well, we should start requiring them to obey the mandate that they shall not practice affirmative action. They should not be running programs that seek to demonize entire races, namely whites, just for existing. And so you start off doing that, and that's how you can do a top-down reform of these universities. Not libertarian to say, oh, that's dictatorial, you shouldn't be issuing these mandates from above. Well, you have to look at how you can reduce the federal budget. Reducing any government program going to always encounter resistance. And the only way you're going to ever make any progress is incrementally. First, by defunding illegal immigrants, defunding refugees, defunding professional leftists. I mean, these are things that would be broadly popular, I think, and would be effective in shrinking the level of government control and size and influence over things.
Right, yeah. And even Trump is obviously not an alt-right person, right? And he's definitely more like mainstream Republican than he is, in the alt-right direction. And the things that he's done is not even really that shocking. Like putting a temporary pause on the immigration, for example, from certain Islamic countries. I think there was like 7 of them. It's not really, to me, it doesn't seem very controversial. It's not like he's in there and he's like, we're going to gas the kikes and, we're going to load all the lefties onto boxcars and, and he's still getting protests every day. He's still getting so much backlash from the left, so much bureaucratic confrontations as far as trying to halt his nominees and shit like that. They're just not going to stop, man. I think it's going to be like this every day this year. I think there's just going to be more and more protests.
Well, maybe eventually they'll get tired of it if they see that it's futile, if they see that it only polarizes the broad public against them. So, the more radical and the more extreme these anti-fascists become, I think the more people will be inclined to rally to Trump's defense. And the more the media keeps lying, blatantly lying about what Trump is doing, they still are calling it a Muslim ban. I can't believe reputable news outlets can get away with calling what Trump did, singling out a few countries that don't represent the vast majority of countries that are Muslim majority, and they're the same countries that were identified by the Obama administration as being funders and exporters of terrorism. So you're right, it's not really a radical policy at all what he's implemented. I mean, I don't think from a policy outcome perspective it's even the best way to go. It's certainly not a solution to the problem of terrorism, let alone harmful immigration in general. But it applies some kind of a filter that will screen out some bad people.
Right. Well, at least it puts a hold on some immigration. I mean, Jesus, it's been such hell under Barack Obama the past 8 years to see any kind of movement towards the right, any kind of right-wing policies is just better. It's just, even if it's just a little better, it's still, even if it's just tiny steps, baby steps, it's still relief, to see the right finally have some power back. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm definitely enjoying it. And, the left always has this sense of entitlement that the future always means progress as they define it. This is where this whole current year thinking came from, that it's 2015. How could you possibly be against feminism, or how could you possibly be against what we advocate? Oh, it's 2016. Now we've moved even further. Now we're not only about gay marriage. Now we're about mandatory transgender training for kindergartners. It's 2016. Now you got Trump. It's 2016. How do you like it now?
Yeah, it actually reminds me of something I talked about in my book, which is about how people see morality as something that's akin to technology. So they see morality as something that progresses, and so these leftists see themselves as because they see their political preferences and their ideals as superior, right? And this presupposes some sort of objective notion of goodness, of moral goodness, or whatever. And as long as you grant them that premise, as long as you grant them that free miracle of there being some sort of objective notion of, moral goodness or whatever, then they can go off and claim, moral superiority, and they can go off and claim, progression, right? So if you have this idea that your lefty values are somehow, there's some moral truth in them, then you can build on that, and you can say, well, it's a good thing that women now have more rights, or that we start eliminating white privilege and all this other nonsense. Obviously, my way of tackling probably debating a lefty is a bit different than yourself, because I'm coming from a more metaethical kind of standpoint. But it is that kind of belief that one's views are somehow objective and binding, right? That they seem to be operating under. And when I talk to these people, sometimes I go, when there's like a feminist or something holding signs around town or something, I'll go talk to them. And they all seem to have this kind of illusion that their slave morality is somehow just, unmistakably intrinsically good, right? Something like, of course, we should have this policy and not that policy. Like there's some sort of moral knowledge that they think they have.
Yeah, but you can't deny that there is political power to their moral dogmatism. I mean, today's SJW was just yesterday's Christian fundamentalist, right? So if you go at them with, well, your morality is not objective, and, well, you try to counter that with moral nihilism, I think that moral nihilism is way too weak a counter to the left's moral dogmatism.
Well, no, what I'm saying is, if you can show them that they're simply that what they're saying is not about truth, it's about power, right? Because that's what they want you to think. They want you to think, and this is how they think, that their values are somehow true and binding, right? And if you can show them that they're not, right? If you can show them that the reason why we disagree is because we have we're operating under different value premises. And values can't be argued to, they can only be argued from. This is something talked about, for example, in Language, Truth, and Logic, Chapter 6, in A.J. Ayer in his book, where he talks about you can't argue two values. Nobody actually argues concerning values. They argue about the facts, right? Even when you think about you think that you're arguing about values, you're actually just arguing about facts. And once someone disagrees with those values, then there's no argument to be had. Then it's just over. Then people just resort to ridicule. And that's what I find is that what I found is a good way of shutting down their whole thing is pointing out, once I point out that their values are baseless, then they have no argument, right? And then you point out exactly what they're doing, that what they're doing has nothing at all to do with truth. It has to do with power. And it's about enforcing your political views through the violence of the state onto other people. That's exactly what it's about. So that's my way of getting through their moral pretentiousness, where they think they're standing in some moral high ground and you're just a racist Nazi. Well, I'll just ask them, why ought I not be a racist Nazi? What's wrong with that? And what does that even mean? What does the term wrong mean? I'm not saying you ought to adopt this method. I'm saying that this is how I approach it, and there are many different ways of doing that, right? That's just one of the ways that I go about it.
Yeah, well, there are different ways of sort of trying to defang the left or delegitimize their moral attacks, and that's the key. You have to not grant their attacks legitimacy. When they call you a racist, misogynist, transphobic piece of shit, you can't just say, "Oh no, look, I have black friends. No, I'm all for women's rights. Oh no, if you just get into that game, then that empowers them more because they see that they've affected you in a way that causes you to become defensive. Your goal should be to cause them to become defensive."
Right. I'm totally straight up honest with these people. I just tell them, look, we have different value premises. I don't value your type of society that you want to institute. I have my own subjective preferences about the society that I want, and that's all that's different here, right? Hold on, sorry. Whoa. All right. That's pretty much what I do. Is I don't grant them those free miracles to build off of, to say that, for example, if they call me a racist, I just say, what does that mean? Define your term. And two, why ought I not be a racist? Right? Because every prescription is going to be based on an if clause. It's going to be based on, well, if you don't want X, then you ought not do Y, right? So what I find is that once you do that, they literally cannot argue with you because there's no argument to be had. It's just, well, if you because they're assuming this premise about society that you're not assuming, right? That, for example, Nietzsche talked about slave versus master morality, and he often inveighed against secular humanism and things like that was basically just a Christian slave morality, but without the God, right? And so success is evil, and it's all based off of ressentiment, right? And so that's where this notion of hatred of white people for their success or white males for their success. There's always this kind of demon class that these people have, people that they want to demonize, because in this type of value system, being underprivileged is a way to become privileged. Being the downtrodden one, the underdog, is a way of being exalted.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's the way they think of it. That to get status, you either have to be a victim or show that you care more about the plight of the victims than you do about exalting yourself or exalting other values.
Yeah, because ultimately it is. I suspect it's egoistic. I suspect, for a lot of them at least, that you see a lot of these social justice warriors that they become full-time social justice warriors, and they go after so-called white privilege, or they become professional feminists, and it's really a way of virtue signaling, and it's a way of making money off this shit, basically. I mean, that's what they're doing. That's what I think, anyways. It's more about them. It's not really about kind of like when you talked about these rich celebrities who adopt, babies from the Congo or whatever. It's about moral signaling, right? It's about, hey, look at me, and look at my moral goodness, and look at how in line with the herd I am.
Right.
I don't know. That's kind of how I see it, but
yeah, I agree.
So let's talk a little bit about race and IQ. It's been a while since I've actually touched on this subject, but maybe you could fill us in on say twin studies, things like that. Do you know of any specific examples?
The big twin study, I think, was called the Minnesota study of twins reared apart or something. I don't remember the exact name of it now, but there's a big Minnesota twin study, and it studied more than just IQ. Basically, it showed that a wide range of personality traits are highly heritable, and various other studies confirm that basically, if you operate under the assumption that any given personality trait is 50% or more heritable, that's a pretty good guide. When it comes to IQ, the consensus seems to be closer to 75% heritable, at least in the United States. And as far as the racial gaps go, those who study race differences in IQ are actually broadly in agreement that there's about a 15-point IQ gap between blacks and whites, with whites having an average IQ of 100, blacks having an average IQ of 85 in the United States, and Asian Americans having an IQ of around 104, 105. There's broad agreement on that. All the test scores confirm it. There is just a recent study that was posted on the Brookings Institute that showed that the SAT score gaps haven't changed in 15 years. And actually, over the past 30 years or so, the gap between Asians and all other races has actually widened. So the opportunity for egalitarians to claim that it's all environmental gets less and less plausible as the evidence continues to come in year after year after year. The same patterns, the same orders, the same consistency, no narrowings. So they can say that there's some cultural thing that we haven't identified, but it seems to be that 75 to 80% of the variations in IQ among the races are explainable by underlying genetic variations.
Where does epigenetics at all play a role in this at all?
Yeah, epigenetics, we're discovering that genes can get turned on or turned off by the environment. But that doesn't really affect heritability estimates, because you're still talking about underlying genes, whether they're being turned on or turned off. Like a small percentage of the population will have something called a variant of the MAOA gene that's been called the warrior gene, that's associated with the proclivity to violence, but not all people who have this gene variant will become violent. But if they grow up in a violent environment during childhood, it's more likely that that gene will get triggered and express itself violently.
So it's kind of like it's there and it may be dormant, but given the right triggering mechanism, external environmental context, it can be turned on, so to speak.
Yeah.
So like maybe you might have like I don't know, like African American, for example, that's living in a primarily white neighborhood, and maybe that gene isn't triggered so much. But say they move to LA or something, it might be easier for them to start expressing that gene. Am I understanding this correctly?
Well, yeah, in some circumstances, but with regard to IQ, I think the best we can do is compare blacks in similar socioeconomic upbringings with whites in similar socioeconomic upbringings in terms of parental income. And if you do that, you find that there's still about 80% of the black-white IQ gap is still there. So there's only like a 20% narrowing after you adjust for socioeconomic status. Now, there could be other cultural factors or things that could be involved, but that's the best we can do as far as estimating broadly socioeconomic environments.
Right. Now, isn't it true that I heard this, and I'm not sure if this is true, but I heard that blacks on average have higher testosterone levels, and that testosterone is correlated to aggressive behavior, violent crime. So
yes.
So, like, for example, males in general commit more violent crimes than females, and they have a higher testosterone level.
Right, and it's also expressed in terms of blacks being more extroverted in their personalities and more aggressive generally. And that's both in males and females. Black females tend to have higher testosterone than white females, although obviously females will have less testosterone than males.
Right. So a black female would have less testosterone than a white male? Do you think?
No, I'm not saying that. A black female would have more. Well, a black female would probably have less testosterone than a white male. Yes, I misunderstood your question.
Oh, okay. So, what about Asians? Do they have like less testosterone than, let's say, a white male, for example, on average?
Yeah, I believe that's the case. Although I did read one study that suggested that there was more of a difference in estrogen, that Asian men tended to have higher estrogen levels.
That's interesting. I've noticed too. There was a study out concerning intelligence and introvertedness, and I can't remember where the study is offhand. But there was this interesting study that was done that suggested that people that have higher intelligence tend to be more introverted, tend to have less friends, or be very socially selective.
Yes, and that would make sense because people who are introverted are going to be more focused on occupying their mind with intellectual thoughts and intellectual stimulus rather than social interaction.
Right. That actually made a lot of sense for me when I read it. It explained me to a T, because I was thinking that maybe I have some mental disorder or something, because I don't really have a lot of real life friends per se. I have friends, but I'm very selective about it. I'm very introverted, and I spend a lot of time, reading and studying 500-page books, for example. And so I just don't have... It's difficult because the average person likes to talk about very superficial things like movies, the clothes they wear, or something like that, whereas I like talking about things like we're talking about now, and most people get turned off by these kinds of discussions.
Yeah, I find when I'm around people who are just really perceptually oriented, like they only want to talk about what kind of external stimulus, whether it's the weather or what's on TV.
Right.
And they tend to jump around from perception to perception. They can never really focus on something that they find interesting. So that's frustrating, but it's just, an innate personality difference, so that we are a very genetically diverse species. And when I used to be more of a Randian objectivist, I would view everything with a moral lens. Like if somebody was dishonest or rude or acted in some way that I found objectionable, I would view that as a moral failing on their part. But now that I'm more of a biological realist, I view manifestations of human behavior in terms of, I wonder what the genetic or environmental causes of this person's behavior are, right? Instead of just assuming that there's some independent conscious entity somewhere in their head that made a choice apart from their own nature and upbringing.
Right.
It's kind of like this transcendental view of human nature, that there's like this overriding super consciousness that makes choices independent of what gave rise to that person's identity in the first place.
Right. I believe you're hinting at dualism there, right? Some sort of, or am I misunderstanding? Like a ghost in the machine or something that's not connected to the biological machine.
Yeah, in effect, I mean, people will say that that's not what they actually mean, but it's, if you posit some kind of moral responsibility that exists universally for all people, regardless of their own individual natures, backgrounds, and experiences, then you're in a way being mystical.
Right, right. Now, I wanted to talk to you about, since the moral nihilist question or topic did kind of get brought up. I noticed in one of your videos, it was one of your live stream videos, where you'd said, and this isn't a big thing or anything like that, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it, but you'd said that basically that moral nihilists wouldn't be involved in politics. And I searched for it before we started recording because I was wondering, I wanted to jot it down and get the exact wording on that. But I wanted to state that that's a very it's a misconception that a lot of people have. But basically, the moral nihilist view is just that, there's no, for example, because there's a couple different kinds. Like there's the moral error theory that all moral propositions are false, and then there's like, expressivism, which is more in my camp, which would say that moral propositions are neither true or false, so they're just expressing emotion. So like if I say X is evil, then I'm really just expressing an emotion and negative attitude about X, right? But it doesn't have like in the world properties. The referent to evil doesn't have, it's not like I'm saying the mic is on my table, right? That has in the world properties. It's an objective thing that I can look at and examine. It has.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree that moral claims are in a different category than objective, true, false claims.
And right, and while knowing this, like while having this information, that doesn't mean that one doesn't have their own preferences. Like, it's impossible to live and not have preferences about society that you want to live in, about what you eat for dinner, or what kind of relationships with others you would like to have. These are all things that moral nihilists or not, you can't get around. These are realities that we have to come to terms with individually as human beings. And so it's not, I guess what I'm getting at here is it's not contradictory to be a moral nihilist and to have certain political or preferences, or even have your own subjective moral values, right? So that's something I did want to kind of bring up, just because I didn't know if what you were operating under there when you made those statements. So,
well, I would say, for example, that if I just have a personal subjective preference for vanilla ice cream, that's a different kind of a preference than if I say I have a preference that you not steal it. That would be a moral claim that you ought not to steal it. Not that you ought not to care whether I like the ice cream, but just that you refrain from doing this action. That's a moral preference.
Right. In his book, The Ruling Passions, Professor, trying to remember his name here. I got it right in front of me, actually. He gives a really cool analogy to this. Where the hell is his name? Okay, Simon Blackburn talks about this kind of staircase of preferences, right? Where it starts off as something basic, like a preference, like what you eat or something like that. Like I like strawberries, is really saying something about you. It's not saying that other people ought to like strawberries. They ought to share your preferences. And then it goes up to, well, I don't associate with anybody who doesn't like strawberries, right? Or I don't associate with anybody who's a racist, for example, right? I'm not personally racist, but then it goes up another thing and becomes a moral preference when we get into how others ought to behave, right? Or how I'm going to treat others because of this, right? So he talks about this staircase, and the farther you go up, then it's well, I'm not going to talk to people who talk to people who talk to people that have this certain view or whatever, or this certain action.
And I think that if you're going to profess moral nihilism at that top level, I would regard that as weak. Now, maybe you have a different definition of nihilism than my general understanding of the term, but nevertheless, I think that my general reflexive reaction to the term nihilism is pretty common. So
Oh
at least
yeah,
from a
yeah,
semantic point
totally.
of view, I
Yeah.
think espousing nihilism is not really an effective appellation for whatever values you're trying to advance.
No, I agree. I guess because I'm approaching this more like individualistically, where I think people that are more nihilists are red pilled in the sense that they don't get caught up in, for example, they can't get caught up in white guilt, right? They can't get caught up in feeling bad for their own success or bad conscience, as Nietzsche used to call it, right? Because you recognize morality for what it is, right? But no, you're not going to it's a theoretical, it's a meta-ethical position, right? It has nothing to do with your normative ethics, right? How you, what you prefer, right? What kind of political party you would choose or whatever, right? But there is a certain advantage to it, right? Which is why I wrote a book on it, because it helps. I think when you can step back and see morality for what it is, you can use it without being controlled by it. Does that make sense?
Okay, so you're saying that nihilism entails the view that moral claims have no truth value; they're just not valid as claims, right? That's the basic premise.
Right. That all moral. Let me preface what we're talking about here. So when I say morality is not true, I'm talking about prescriptive morality, not descriptive morality or applied ethics or any of that. I'm talking about prescriptive morality, how one ought live, right? And so the moral nihilist would say that there are no moral oughts that have any. There are no moral oughts. There are only rational oughts. Or so, in other words, to put it in a Kantian sense, there are no categorical imperatives. There are only hypothetical imperatives. So if I say you ought not kick puppies for fun, for example, then that raises the question, according to whom, right? Why ought I not kick puppies for fun? There's simply no sense and reason in an ought or an imperative without punishment and reward, right? So what I think what people are saying is when they say you ought not do something, is they're either just emoting, they're just expressing an emotion, or they're saying if you don't want consequence B, you ought not commit action C, right? And that's how government works, right? If you don't want to go to jail, you ought not murder. If you don't want to, whatever, if you don't want to pay a fine, you ought wear your seatbelt, that kind of stuff. It's all in the context of promise and reward and punishment, basically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't know that morality is limited to a sense of punishment and reward. When I introspect about things that I regard as moral goods or moral evils, I have a strong sense that things either should or shouldn't be a certain way, that people should or shouldn't act in a certain way. And the claim reduces to my own personal view, not an objective, universal truth statement, but nevertheless, my moral senses are just as real as my aversion to physical pain or heat or cold or anything else.
Right. Yeah, no. Those are subjective, though. You'd agree with that, right?
On a metaphysical level, yeah, it's subjective.
Right, because, I guess when we talk about objective morality, we're talking about objective moral values and duties. And so the moral nihilist is saying those are just pure nonsense. They don't exist, right? There's no objective moral values and duties. There's no objective prescription because all prescriptions are based on if clauses. That is the if I want, right? If I want to if I want to do X, if I want X, I ought to do Y, for example, right? So every imperative is contingent upon an if clause. Does that make sense, or do you have any disagreement there, or can you give me an example of one that maybe isn't?
Well, in order to convert a basic moral sense into something that's a truth proposition, yeah, you have to have an if-then clause. Because otherwise, if there's no if clause and it's just an assertion, then it can't be evaluated as true or false.
So are you saying that hypothetical imperatives are moral oughts?
I'm not sure what you mean.
So are you saying that reasoning like if I want X, I ought to do Y is a moral proposition?
No, if I make the statement that if you want to have friends, then you should be nice, that's not saying that you have a moral obligation to be nice, but it is a statement of that can be evaluated as true or false, I guess.
Yeah, it's a fact, right? If you want this, you ought to do that. But I think what a lot of people don't think about this deeply enough, and so they end up like, if you take like Sam Harris, for example, who wrote the Moral Landscape, he'll like equivocate the rational oughts with moral oughts. So then morality becomes about what's strategic, like good moves in chess, right? But then he's forced to, if he's going to be consistent, he's forced to say something like, if I want to kill as many people as possible, I ought poison the water supply, right? I don't think anybody in their right mind would argue that that's a moral proposition, right? That's just it's just a strategic ought. It's just, if I want to accomplish this, I ought to do that, right? It's not anything moral per se. So then the goals are the only thing that we could really classify as moral. It's that I guess that end, right? And ends are always subjective. They're always based off of what you want. And that's what we mean by subjective. It's contingent upon minds, right? There are no like intrinsic values. There's nothing that's valuable independent of whether minds exist. Because when we say that something is valuable, we're just expressing an emotion about a thing that just is, right? We agree there?
Right, yeah. And Sam Harris, I watched one of his, I think it was his debate with that Christian debater. Forgot his name now. But he was advocating his version, what he proposed to be a secular version of objective morality. Right. And I think that's nonsensical. I don't think that morality is objective. It can't be external to us.
Right.
And it can't be something that is not a product of our minds, unless you're going to propose something supernatural, right? So right. I don't advocate objective morality, but I do advocate a morality that is real in the sense that it derives from our nature, and our nature is objective.
Right.
And so I believe that the purpose of morality is to align with our nature. And so that's how I would evaluate actions as good or evil, is whether they promote flourishing or they act in direct opposition to flourishing.
Right.
So I wouldn't call that nihilism. To me, somebody who says nihilism would say no, and none of it matters.
Yeah, the labels don't really matter. I mean, do what works for you. I was just kind of bringing this up as a kind of like to get you see where people like me are coming from, so that you can understand that you can be a moral nihilist in the meta-ethical sense and not be like, because a lot of people, when they hear nihilist, they think of like things like passive nihilism, like teenage angst or something like that, right? Like some kid who woke up on the wrong side of the bed and he's just moaning about the inherent meaninglessness in life. Or like, for example, Nietzsche used nihilism in many different ways. He talked about Christian nihilism, and he talked about the nihilism of society and passive. He used, like Nietzsche himself was a nihilist, but he was an active nihilist, which is the kind of nihilism I am talking about. And then he also railed against passive nihilism, which is the left, right? That's passive nihilism. It's a kind of morality that's slave morality, that's anti-life. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but a lot of these social justice warriors, some of them actually end up becoming somewhat anti-natalistic, right? Because Nietzsche pointed out that because life is will to power, because each life form, each organism seeks to extend its force, to see its will actuated, right? We do this in everything that we do. When we move our arms, we're trying to actualize our desire to have some coffee. Or if we, when we engage in politics, when we vote for somebody, it's about who's going to institute our preferences through the violence of the state onto everybody else, right? So it's that will to power, and that's what morality is ultimately about. It's about controlling human behavior. I mean, after all, morality is about how people ought to behave, right? So they have this kind of different way where they see the nature of life. They see the nature of life and they hate it. They want everything to be equal. They want to suppress the nature of life itself, which is, as Nietzsche said, exploitation, right? For example, of exploitation, we eat other organisms in order to, survive, in order to pass on our genes and to accomplish everything else we want to do in life, to clothe ourselves, right? We put our will, our desires, over the will of other organisms, okay? And that's kind of what life is about. And that may seem grim, as Nietzsche admitted, but you're left with either that or you're left with this leftist slave morality where we're trying to suppress the nature of life. We're trying to make everything equal, and there can't be any exploitation whatsoever. And any inequality must be suppressed. Every valley must be made low. Like, that's how these people think, right? And so that's a what he would call passive morality or passive nihilism. I don't know if that.
Yeah, well, I would view egalitarianism as at root a revolt against nature, certainly much more explicitly so than Christianity or most other religions. And I don't claim that might makes right, but I do believe that right requires might, and that just being right without having a will to power to enact is pointless. It's like having morality that is completely impotent.
Well, would you agree with this, that might makes right in the sense that it takes power to institute your morality, to enforce your morality, right? So, like, you ought not steal. Well, every cop's job is to answer the ultimate question, or else what, right? There was a conversation between a kid and a cop that Jack Donovan talked about in one of his essays, and the kid walked up to the cop and he said to him, I think this was in his essay, "Violence is Golden" or something. It might have been that. But he asked the cop, "Why do we need cops?" And he says, and he leans down at the kid and he looks at him all serious and he says, "Do you have any doubt in your mind that if I wanted to, I could break your books, or break your arm and pry those books from you?" And he says, "No." And he says, "That's why you need cops, right?" So in other words, might is right in the sense that it is, power is the tool by which we enforce our ideals. Would you agree with that definition?
I would agree that right requires might, but right is not a concept that derives from might.
No. That would be an is-ought fallacy, right? That would be saying, I can do something, therefore I ought to do something, right? It would be,
right.
Right. Yeah, we agree there. So we're basically saying the same thing. We're just saying it in different ways. Yeah, that's pretty cool. All right, yeah, that's the only thing. I remember you had commented in one of my videos. I think it was on that kind of subject of might is right, and you had said something like that. Might doesn't make right, right? But it is sufficient to, secure that. I don't remember your exact words, but I remember that. I remember you commenting on that. So.
Yeah, I mean, we may have talking about very similar things conceptually, just using different language. Like the issue of nihilism may be analogous to that of anarchy, that people who profess to be anarchists are using the term in a way that most people don't recognize, or that would, to the common usage of the term, is different than the technical usage in political philosophy.
Right. You're talking about like the Russian revolutionaries who went under the term nihilist. I talked about that a little bit in the introduction to my book. To kind of, the first thing I do in my book is define terms, because these terms, as you see, have a lot of fucking baggage behind them. So, but yeah, I know what you're referring to, and those were usually like socialists and very left-leaning, ideologically speaking. Yeah. I actually use the term political nihilist, but I use it very differently. I just mean it that all political ideologies are subjective. They have no firm foundation. But I don't use it in the same sense as the way the term was originally used by Russian nihilists. Have you ever read the book Fathers and Sons, for example?
No.
Okay, that was a book that supposedly coined the term nihilism, and it was written back in the 1800s, I believe. And there's a Baravezov, I can't say his fucking name. I think it's something like that, Baravezov or something like that, the nihilist. And he defines a nihilist as somebody who doesn't bow down to, who is skeptical and doesn't bow down to any principle because of authority, right? So I would agree with nihilism to that extent, because I think here's the thing, being a moral realist can make you very prone to being manipulated into these types of movements. So if you go into college and you're a moral realist, and you're going to be easily taught that you have white privilege, and equality is good, and egalitarianism is good, and not letting in refugees is bad, and looking out for your own interests is bad. Like, you're going to be easily taught those things, right? But if you're educated on this subject, then you can look at those claims and go, I know exactly what he's doing right now, right? I understand what morality is about. Right? It's about influencing behavior, influencing emotion and then influencing behavior, changing people's sentiments. Like, we use moral language in a lot of different ways. We use language to, like, commands, like, you ought not do X, or we use it to express emotion about X. I just think that it's definitely not for everybody, but it's definitely a way of being red-pilled that will save you a lot of playing the fool, basically.
But we're only talking about a small percentage of people who will ever even be capable.
Yeah, that's true.
Practically.
That's true, huh?
Developing philosophical views via reason. The vast majority of people will adopt the views that are socially reinforced.
That's very true.
That's just the way that we are wired psychologically, I think, for most people. And, it kind of makes sense evolutionarily, because if everybody sat around developing their own philosophy, the food would never get gathered, and the babies would never get made. So,
philosophy itself is a kind of a product of, modernity, of having that time, through agriculture and mass production, of being able to have time to sit and think about these things, because we didn't have that as, like, hunter-gatherers, right?
Yeah, and so I still consider myself an atheist, but I've increasingly come to see the social utility and perhaps necessity, at least from a historical perspective, of formal religions.
Right, right. Well, religion is another power structure. Morality is a power structure, and then religion is one. And there are these people in the alt right that a lot of them will argue that Christianity is the glue of Western civilization. Right? There may be some truth to that, but it doesn't make it true. Right? There's an example. It makes it practical if that's true, but it doesn't make it true. There's a distinction between utility and truth, right? So
Right.
natural selection does what works. It doesn't necessarily do what's true.
Yeah, that kind of drives me crazy as a logical thinker to hear people say, well, they obviously don't literally believe Christianity is true. It's just useless as an explanation of how the world began and anything else like that. But they think, well, it's good that people believe it anyway. Like, that's a totally disingenuous argument.
Yeah, you have no
That you're
idea.
going to
I've run
promote
this.
Christianity. You're going to tell people they should believe it, but you don't believe it yourself. But that's one strain of the alt-right that still wants to make Christianity the central moral driver of it. And then there are people more like me who come from a more Enlightenment, evolutionary Darwinian perspective.
Right.
I guess you could say, broadly speaking, a naturalist perspective, or at root a materialistic perspective on human nature and development. And then there are some weird people who get into occult stuff and National Socialist stuff.
Paganism.
Yeah, there's pagans, Odinists.
Yep.
They think that Odinism is the organic religion of the European people. Maybe we'd be better off with Odinism than Christianity. I don't know.
I'm like sympathetic to that. I think we would be better off in my subjective ideal, that is, because it was a warrior culture, right? They didn't have slave morality. The values were master values, and they wouldn't, for example, have had a huge immigration problem. And they certainly, that kind of culture would not produce SJWism. And I've noticed that every formerly Christian country is now overrun by lefties, is now overrun by cultural Marxism and critical theory being pumped into kids' heads in their schools. Like, it seems to be, to me anyways, coming from a Nietzschean perspective, that Christianity is the platform by which these ideologies spring or thrive.
Yeah, you can see the prerequisites, at least in some areas, in Christianity, of how social justice is manifesting. The altruism, the turning the other cheek, the original sin, which is now, the white privilege is our original sin as white people.
Right. Yeah, that's what I've been noticing. Wherever. And Nietzsche talked a lot about this bad conscience, and that's what I think of when I hear, white guilt, all that stuff. It's all bad conscience, and it's a way of controlling people. Once you can convince a populace that success is evil, their success is evil. Success meaning maybe being intelligent, or the white race as a whole has been very successful and has colonized many parts of the globe, and has created modern industry and architecture and music and everything else. To see that kind of success as evil because equality is good and anything unequal is bad. So it's again of destroying any kind of exceptionalism, demonizing the exceptionals of mankind. And
yeah, it turns morality on its head. It turns virtue into vice, because by being virtuous, you are being unequal.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what I've seen, and that's the big part of the reason why I wrote that book on metaethics, which was to basically cure at least some people of bad conscience.
Well, if you could rid white people of guilt, which the left has used as a weapon to turn whites against themselves and against their civilizations, that would be probably the most important thing you could do.
Right,
because it's this guilt that's been hijacked, probably by people who largely know what they're doing. If you think about the Freudians and the cultural Marxists out of the Frankfurt School, I think they knew what they were doing and exploiting the white vulnerability of guilt.
Right, and guilt. Just to clarify, guilt is not an evil thing. It's just that, guilt is very useful as an in-group value. It's cohesive. And you obviously can't have a cohesive group, a tribe, if you will, without guilt, right? You need to feel bad, a negative emotion about harming somebody within the tribe unnecessarily, if the tribe is to exist. But when you have this kind of pathological guilt or pathological altruism, where you are extending that same courtesy to people who don't care whether you live or die, who don't care about the tribe, who don't care about your interests, then you're being pathologically guilt-ridden, and that's what we're seeing is pathological altruism. We got to let everybody in, and we got to share our success with everybody. And so it's this kind of, we see again of this example of universalizing morality, which Nietzsche talked a lot about.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm seeing signs that maybe they've pushed so far and they've gotten so explicit with their anti-white agenda that it may actually be something that is finally turning more white people against it, just in an instinctive reaction sense, saying this is absolutely ridiculous. Can't take any more of this. They're inviting the kind of backlash that may finally turn the trend around.
Yeah, I think that we need to stop fighting about who's the racist, right? I see this going on a lot even with somewhat red-pilled people, Republicans and such, of fighting over who's the racist. I prefer to, I understand not everybody can do that. Not everybody can just give that up. But I prefer to say, I'll just grant them all of that. I'll grant them all of the dirty names they want to call me. And I'll say, then what? Now, what's your argument? That works for me. Obviously, if you're running for office, that's not going to work for you. But I think we need to stop really, as a whole, trying to defend ourselves and actually make the left argue for once. Because all they've done recently is just throw tantrums. That seems to be, I don't know. Have you seen Cantwell's? Cantwell did a video. It was this past summer, where he confronted these feminists, and he just laid into them. He yelled and screamed in their face. He got really up close to them, and got it all on videotape. You can go watch it on YouTube. It's pretty funny. And it was, I think the title of it was something like, "This is how you argue with feminists." And it was basically, he didn't argue at all. And that was kind of the point. The point is that these people are so irrational, and they have no actual supporting arguments for their position. So it's best to kind of troll the shit out of them, basically. And make them look like the whiny little infantiles that they really are,
Yeah, well, Chris Cantwell is somebody who can actually make them fear for their safety. I don't think I'm quite that intimidating, but when argumentation is not possible, then you have to go for an effort at some other kind of psychological.
So I actually had some technical difficulties, and my favorite jumped on my keyboard and pushed the wrong button, and so unfortunately we lost part of the interview. So I figured here I would insert Christopher Cantwell's confrontation that we were just referring to in here. So I will go ahead and give you the audio to the video we were actually referring to, where he was yelling at those feminists this past summer.
We're done speaking to you now.
Okay, good. Then don't fucking speak. Stand there and shut the fuck up.
Looks like we've got a rape culture demonstration over here. I'm sure they're just chock full of, intellectual values. So I figured I'd go talk to them, try to get some education. Hey, what's going on here? Don't get raped. What causes rape? Rapists. Rape is not a sport. No excuse for rape and violence. Who's making excuses for rape?
I think most people do. I think most people make excuses about what women are wearing, what their pasts are, their past promiscuous behavior, and all sorts of things that have to do with the victims and the rapists.
But usually when somebody is talking about the past or the actions of the alleged victim,
Right.
What they're doing is they're calling into question whether or not she actually was raped, right? We're not talking about rape is okay. Nobody's saying go ahead and brutally fuck the shit out of women while they scream for help. Nobody does that, right?
I think that that's people's intentions, and that's how they're making excuses. But I think what we're forgetting is that women aren't always calling out and screaming for help when they're raped. Rape is just a lack of consent. Consent is a verbal yes, assuming someone has the ability to speak. Consent is someone saying, yes, I want this. There are many people who don't necessarily even say the word no and are being raped because they feel pressured, they feel forced, or they don't have the ability to say no.
Well, with all due respect, it's complete fucking nonsense, and you know that it is. So if one of you whores goes to a frat party, gets drunk, and grabs a man by the dick, what happened then? No, I'm not gonna fucking leave you alone.
You want to come up here and spread communist fucking propaganda and redefine felony crimes and tell us that we're being fucking rapists because you get drunk at a party and grab somebody by the dick? Is that rape? If you get drunk and drag somebody by the fucking dick and said, are they a rapist?
I didn't say that.
So, you said they need a verbal yes. So if you grab somebody by the dick, that's not a verbal yes, is it?
If they don't give me a verbal yes, then I would be a rapist if I did that.
Okay,
yes,
so how many of you fucking whores grab somebody by the dick and
I
went
have
to
never
jail?
in my life done that.
No, you've never done that? I'm not gonna fucking leave you alone. Why don't you get the fuck out of here? Why don't you go spread your commie horse shit somewhere else?
Will you please explain to me why this is communism?
Because it's a fucking nonsense horseshit idea that doesn't make any fucking sense. Perpetual revolution. It's Trotskyite nonsense where you try to overturn the fucking genders. That's what you're doing. It has nothing to do with rape. Nobody over here is talking about it's okay to fucking rape women. Nobody does that. Nobody does that. You're making shit up. And you're changing the definition of rape to try to justify your fucking lunatic agenda. And it's horseshit. And you should all be fucking ashamed of yourselves. And any fucking man who comes anywhere near any one of you fucking slags is an idiot.
We're done speaking to you now.
Okay, good. Then don't fucking speak. Stand there and shut the fuck up. Because that's what you should have done in the first place. Nobody needs your stupid fucking asshole opinion. Fuck you. So go fuck yourselves, you stupid cunts.
Hoping the fucking police show up. But
police
it's
don't have
stupid to keep on arguing with them, not even saying anything back. It's just I could just yell at them for fucking hours, which don't get me wrong. It's basically what I do for 2 hours a day, 3 days a week, from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on the Radical Agenda. But if they're not gonna say anything, they're just standing like fucking assholes, knowing that there's no point to what the fuck they're talking about. Then how much fun is it to keep on yelling at them?
Okay, that was the video. And on a side note, before I let you listen to the rest of the interview with the libertarian realist. I actually run into those same feminists because I live, well, close to where that happened. And so I'd actually ran into those feminists earlier in the day before he did and argued with them. And they were just, it was absolutely pointless. I could see within the first few minutes that it was absolutely pointless arguing with these people. And there was actually more of them when I was there. But in this video that I just showed, there was only a few of them there. So, but there was actually a guy that was there with them, and he was holding up a sign too. And so anyways, just a side note. So I'll go ahead and play the rest of the conversation. That is the last part of the conversation. The part that the ferrets didn't manage to delete. So here we go.
Libertarians, classical liberals, and liberals who reject the tactics of the radical left. But once you cross that line and you start physically attacking people or denying people's right to free speech, then there's no more argument to be had. There's just going to be a battle, and you get whatever is coming to you in terms of retaliation, and you ought to be scared. And it's the duty, if I could use that word in a non-literal way, of advocates of civilization to bring to bear whatever is necessary to make the enemies of civilization fear them.
Right. Well, here's exactly what I wrote. I wrote, I'm only about 5'8" with my shoes on. With that said, however, I was on the mean streets for years. I have been in more physical confrontations in my time. I was also in the Army than I care to remember. I've had some stitches and staples. I've taken some nasty hits, and I've dished them out. About, and then I talked about how they put hands on this girl. And, I basically stated that my attitude, if I was there, and I know this about myself, if I was there, you'd have seen just leftists being chucked around on, the nightly news. You would have just seen them flying like the guy hit by a tornado. Because there's no way that someone's going to put hands on me and walk away. They may get carried away. They may crawl away through a pool of their own blood, but they're not going to walk away if they put hands on me. And I think that's the kind of attitude that more people need to have. Because if more people start defending themselves, it's going to make it too costly for these rugrats to put hands on people. You know what I mean? And even, Richard Spencer has realized recently, after getting hit in the face twice in one day, that, he's got to have backup with him now. Because I don't take it that Richard is much of a fighter. He just doesn't seem like that type. I could be wrong, but he just doesn't seem like that kind of confrontational type. But I'd seen the video where he got punched, and I was thinking, geez, I would have took off after that guy. I would have ran after that dude. I would have run him down in the streets. And I've actually done that when I lived in California. Some guy threatened me, and then he actually sucker punched me, and I chased his ass down. And I took out my cell phone and I called the cops, and I had him on the ground pinned, and called the cops, and they arrested his ass, right? And I pressed charges on him, and that's the way you got to do it. You can't let people walk all over you, because the more you do that, the more they're going to keep doing it. And that's kind of like what needs to start happening. And I don't know. I think a lot of people are afraid to do anything to defend themselves, because they're probably afraid that, they'll get hit with some charge for, I don't know, how the laws are with political violence. And they're probably afraid that if they get attacked by some Antifa and he's colored or something, that they're going to get hit with some sort of racial crime or, something like that. That could be one of the things going through their heads. I don't know. But it really pissed me off that those cops just sat around there on Berkeley and just watched all that happen. Even as that trailer got turned over and set on fire, and those kids were slamming things into the glass, trying to get in the building. Like, I don't understand that at all. Like, I just really don't. Other than just the mayor must have been like, don't take any action. You know, I mean, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, just imagine if it was all neo-Nazis behaving in the way that anti-fascists so-called behave. The reaction would have been far different among the police, and the coverage would have been far different in the media. Right. That's for sure. But for most of us, this battle isn't going to involve physical confrontation.
Oh, that's
but
true,
it may involve confrontation on message boards or on Twitter or whatever. And the alt-right has an army of trolls who have really done a lot of, they brought a lot of attention to their cause, that's for sure.
Right.
And I don't endorse the ideology of a lot of these people, especially the ones who outright call themselves neo-Nazis and tweet at people gas chamber memes and things like that. But I would say this, some people absolutely deserve it. Even though I don't support it ideologically, some people absolutely deserve to get gas chamber memes tweeted at them, because these are people who will go on and say things like, very explicitly, like, well, as a Jew, I have to support white privilege training programs and the forced taxpayer importation of refugees from the third world as a Jew. So right there, they politicized their religious identity. They made that a political issue. And they've used it as a weapon to try to expand the power of government and undermine the demographics of white people in general. So that's kind of intellectual warfare that they've engaged in. So they absolutely deserve gas chamber memes.
I remember Nietzsche talking about his hatred for socialists, the socialists of his day, which were, he really hated them because they were, well, one of the reasons was because they were inciting resentment from the working class, right? And, creating huge division. And that's exactly what the left has done with race relations in this country, especially in this past year with the Trump thing. It's been very polarized, although I was encouraged that one of there's like one black guy that I know in this whole town, and he actually voted for Trump. And I've heard a lot of people in the alt-right, like I think it may have been like the Daily Show or something like that, who say that there's probably going to be, because of this division and because it's becoming so, the gap is widening so much that there might be some freaking race war at some point in the near future. What do you think about that? Do you think that there will be, like you'd said, like a few minutes ago, that you didn't think that most of us would have to worry about actual violent confrontation, but do you think that maybe you could be wrong about that?
Well, it's possible. I think an actual bloody race war is unlikely to be on a large scale in the United States, because it's more of like the anti-fascists who are trying to instigate a race war are just a tiny group of people, right? They're not
right.
They're mostly white people, actually. So I don't see the great
that's a
battle
good point.
ahead as being that of a literal race war. I think it's still more of an intellectual war, and it's primarily a war for the minds of white people. It's not a war to try to persuade black people that white people have a right to exist. It's a war to persuade white people that white people have a right to exist.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. I think we're getting towards the end here. I don't know. What do you think? Like, I'd asked you this in the beginning, but what do you think are realistic accomplishments? Like, do you think that, for example, I hate to get blackpilled here, but do you think like maybe we'll get to the end of the 4 years of Trump presidency and we'll end up seeing another? Okay, here's the thing that kind of gets me, that kind of makes me blackpilled about the future of the United States, and that is that they're brainwashing these kids on a mass level. And these kids are, in high school, and these kids are in, like the kids that are not yet in voting age are going to be, and the kids that are now in voting age primarily are all left-leaning. And my concern is that the right is not going to be able to win an election at some point here soon because of the fact that, even this election with Trump was electorally, it wasn't close. Electorally, he won pretty decently, but populace-wise, he didn't win very. I think Hillary technically got more people to vote for her, and in a popular election, she probably would have won. But it's scary to me because I think that as time goes on, it's going to be less and less likely that the right's going to be able to win any elections because of the mass indoctrination that is happening in public schools.
There's no question that the left believes strongly that demographics is on their side and that's their future. And they thought that somebody like Trump would have already been demographically impossible.
Right.
They were just kind of laughing it off in the Republican primaries. Oh, this is a last gasp of white America for a time decades past. That this is 2016. This can't happen now. Well, it did. But ultimately, the left, if the demographic trends continue, will reach a point where it is impossible to elect somebody like Donald Trump to the presidency. So, yes, if Trump does nothing to revive the demographics that vote Republican, then this could be the last gasp of white America. And if so, then we have 4 years to enjoy it before America goes to hell. But there's a chance that there's more of an opportunity than that. But Republicans will have to expand their appeal to a broader range of white people in areas like Trump successfully did in the Great Lakes state. But he didn't quite win over New Hampshire, did he? It was very close. But New Hampshire, Maine, and Oregon on the West Coast, a lot of white people in Oregon that I think are close and reachable to coming over to the Republican side. I think Trump gets it, but I think he is a demographic realist in the way that Democrats are, and most Republicans are just in denial about. But whether he can actually get through all the judges and the obstinate Republicans to actually get through an agenda that improves the demographics of this country, I don't know. He's exceeded all my expectations so far since he started running. So maybe some kind of miracle, Donald Trump may end up being the man that saves Western civilization. That's not something I necessarily believe. It's not something that we need to believe. It's just something we need at this point to work for because it is possible.
Right. And it's not just high school and college and all that. It's not just education and academia. It's the TV. And if you look at TV shows, for example, like when I was growing up, and I'm suspecting you're probably around the same age. I'm 36. I was born in 80. So you're probably, right around the same age. I don't know if you noticed, Three's Company, right? With the
I remember
Jack,
that, yeah.
who was pretending to be gay, and then you jump all the way to, past the 90s and whatever. You see that then you've got Will and Grace, and it's like this slow indoctrination through the media of what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And some people have argued that it's really society that it's the other way around. Society, it becomes acceptable in society, and so it becomes acceptable on TV. I disagree. I think it's the other way around. I think that TV is a way for the left to indoctrinate people. And I've noted that all the people I've known in my life, most of them watch TV, and a lot of TV. I don't have one. I haven't had one since 2006, right? So I don't have that problem. But I've noticed that, and it's because whenever I watch TV now, like if I go over to someone's house and they have TV on, all I can do is just see the narrative in everything, right? It's grotesque to me. Like when I watch a movie now, I just see the narrative. I see the liberal narrative. So it's hard for me to, I'm not going to pay for that shit, right, to go in my brain. But with all those factors, with education, with the media, Hollywood, TV, cable, all that stuff, it causes me to think very black pill-like. Causes me to think that the indoctrination is just too widespread. And I don't know. I mean, without some sort of radical change in the next 4 years, I question whether he can even be president again, whether he can win another 4 years after that. I just really question that. But then again, I was wrong about him getting elected in the first place. I was definitely thinking he was going to lose to Hillary, and that I should move somewhere else or go live in a cave somewhere. But I'm glad I was wrong, and I hope I'm wrong again. So.
Well, yeah, but put it in perspective. Yeah, the narrative is being pumped out through all these mainstream channels, but the counter narrative is growing. It's growing bigger and bigger and bigger on the internet, on podcasts such as this one, and the mainstream media was defeated single-handedly by Donald Trump. They were rendered irrelevant, and that's what they're going to increasingly become.
That's true. I did not see how biased towards the left the media was until this year, or till last year, I should say. I couldn't even watch it anymore. I was so red-pilled then because of how they treated Trump and the unfair treatment. So I saw just how biased they were, and it just sickened me. It made me realize that they were just really the Clinton News Network, and not that I was ever much into watching news, but in the first place, but it was definitely a red pill as far as how politics work here in America and stuff. But do you want to plug anything, any kind of website or anything? I'll post some of your links to your YouTube channel and your blog site on my website. And my YouTube channel is Libertarian Realist. You do a search for Libertarian Realist, and I will come up on YouTube and Twitter, and I have a blog as well. Yep, and I'll go ahead and end this, but I was hoping you'd just stay on for a few more minutes. But I'll go ahead and stop the recording. If you have enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share on your favorite social networking site. Also, please head on over to www.powernihilism.education. Follow and subscribe via Google Plus or Gmail so that you can receive notifications concerning future essays and other content. On my site, you also have the ability to read my book concerning metaethics for free and or purchase the hardcover edition. Thanks, and stay tuned.